Picking up from where we left off with part 1, today I'll be going into the second half of what I think are the absolute best games on the TurboGrafx-16. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, then I recommend checking that out too. And of course, any of the other videos I have about this library. Don't really need much more of an intro than that, so let's get into it. The Turbo's library is full of well-known shooters, and we'll definitely be hitting several of them in this video. But first, I want to start with Psychosis, a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up that quickly whittles down your lives with its, at times, severe challenge, which is only compounded by the distractingly bizarre visuals and music. Psychosis takes place inside an insane person's mind that's been taken over by an evil force, so you're here to eradicate it. Kinda like something you might catch the Magic School Bus doing, except with a lot more shooting and nightmare fuel. Taking place inside of a psychotic mind, of course, opens the floodgates for Naxat Soft to throw every insane idea they could at it, and they very much did. Despite almost everything you see and hear being a baffling cacophony of nonsense, it kind of forms a strange sort of coherence that makes each level or cause really stand out. I really enjoy the presentation all around here. Lots of vivid colors and some scrolling layers here and there, giving the game a lot of depth. Also, the music sounds like it was written by King Crimson or something, and I really enjoy how the offbeat rhythms and unconventional chord structures complement the equally strange visuals. It all goes together really well. If I had to come up with any gripes, I guess it would be the moderate amount of visual glitches and slowdown that you do run into at times. It's really not that bad, and as any Turbo fan will tell you, you kinda learn to accept that in some of these games, especially the shooters. Otherwise, though, Psychosis is basically flawless and comes highly recommended from me as long as you don't mind some pretty stiff challenge. You don't get a lot of lives and you will lose them often. This is also one of those shooters where you lose all of your power-ups every time you die, so good luck clawing your way back in later levels. This is one of the most underrated shoot-'em-ups on the system, and thusly of all time. It's only got 5 levels, but given that you'll be dying a lot, I wouldn't worry about the game feeling short. Also, if you do somehow manage to beat it, you get thrown into a new game plus of sorts, where you get to keep your power-ups you beat the game with, but all of the enemy fire is a lot faster, and the enemies themselves take substantially more damage. So if your thumbs are still intact by this point, you can give that a whirl. Psychosis is phenomenal. Definitely give it a try. Ninja Spirit is a lot of people's favorite game on the Turbo, and while I don't quite see it that way, I think it is certainly fair to say it's in the upper tier. This is an exceptional action game from Irem that nails almost every aspect from top to bottom. There weren't a lot of ninja games on the Turbo. I guess Tiger Road sort of qualifies, but that's not a particularly good game. So if Turbo players wanted a Shinobi or Ninja Gaiden alternative, Ninja Spirit was and still is the game to get. Irem was no slouch on the Turbo, having also released Vigilante, Legend of Hero Tonma, and R-Type all within a couple of years of each other, and they're all pretty good games. Ninja Spirit has to be the best of them though, with energetic music and fierce non-stop combat, keeping the intensity high from the first few seconds all the way to the final moments of the last boss. You play Moonlight, who also can summon up 2 spirits to follow in his footsteps, and also multiply his attacks, which can feel downright essential on most levels, as the enemies are constantly flooding the screen and will overwhelm you quickly if you aren't staying on top of them. This does throw the balancing of the difficulty a bit out of whack though, and points to what I think is the only real flaw with the game. When Moonlight is on his own, it's an absolute workout to make any progress. You'll be hopping all around the screen like a jackrabbit, barely inching forward until you can get some weapon upgrades and the spirit clones back. But once that happens, then the game becomes a little too easy in my opinion. Especially the bosses, who are very fun to fight and really well designed, but they can all be defeated with just a few seconds of uninterrupted shurikens or bombs if you have all 3 characters. Now you can enable arcade mode, which turns on one-hit kills, which does mitigate that maybe a little bit, but again, once you have your 2 spirits and some weapons upgraded, you're pretty much unstoppable 90% of the time. This doesn't even come close to ruining the game by any means though. Ninja Spirit is a great time, with levels that don't overstay their welcome, and a fun variety of weapons to play around with. The outstanding music and level designs are, on their own, more than worth the time it'll take you to reach the end, which is about 45 minutes, maybe an hour. You can even listen to the songs here, where they actually show you a little virtual equalizer displaying the different sound channels. Kinda neat. The detail and incredible range of color of the visuals give the impression that this was a later release for the system, but it was actually released in 1990 as a port of Irem's original '88 arcade version. So it's actually a bit ahead of its time in a lot of ways. The Turbo's 8-bit processor barely hangs on for dear life in some moments, with a lot of flickering sprites and slowdown, but ultimately I think the trade-off is worth it. I also think I prefer how the Turbo version looks over the arcade version. Seems to use contrast a little bit better, and maybe it's a little more colorful too. Although the arcade version certainly runs better, so pick your poison I guess. Both are great. You can actually get the arcade version on PSN right now via the arcade archives for just a few bucks. So that's not a bad way to go, honestly. No matter how you play Ninja Spirit though, just ensure that you do. Another criminally underrated shooter on the Turbo that never really gets its due, in my opinion, is Cybercore. With the avalanche of shooters on the system, and many of them borrowing a lot of thematic ideas from each other, Cybercore really stands out to me with its insect theme and crazy evolutions of your ship. Developed by Alpha System, who also had a hand in the pretty good but not quite as good as this game Sinistron, Cybercore is one of the better top-down shooters on the system, in my humble opinion. You start out as a little bug, but eventually get to choose between several different bug types, and each can be upgraded twice. And they each have different weapon types, although nothing totally game-changing for the most part. It really just comes down to preference. The downside of upgrading is that your ship becomes a much bigger target, so it's not always the right idea. If you do upgrade though, your ultimate form always looks insanely cool, as do all of the bosses and enemies. Most of the designs here are actually reminiscent of real insects, but also clearly take some wacky liberties with them. The bosses are also excellently designed, with crazy firing patterns, and they keep you guessing, with sometimes requiring bombs or regular fire to do damage. Also, bonus points for being able to change your speed with the select button. I find the base speed to be fine for most of the game actually, but you'll definitely want to turn it up in the last couple of levels. Gotta make a point to really shout out the soundtrack here. Composed by Masahiro Teramoto, who also worked on the music for Tricky Kick, which is really the only thing I like about that game. The soundtrack here in Cybercore is a stroke of genius. The melodies are epic and catchy, with lots of great bass parts and fluttering middle voices that really remind you of flies or bees buzzing around your ears. There's some great tunes in here, but the fact that they complement the insect theme so well really elevates the overall package. As cool as the level designs are, I guess I would have preferred a tad more detail in some of them. They can be a little on the bland side at times. There's also no scrolling layers to speak of, and very little animation in the backgrounds. But I guess in exchange for that, we do get a game that runs really smooth basically all the time, with almost none of the slowdown or flickering that a lot of other Turbo games suffer from. It's the great enemy variety, music, and upgradable ships to play around with that make this game excellent, and I highly recommend it. Kinda like how Newtopia is the Turbo's answer to Zelda, Dungeon Explorer is sort of their answer to Gauntlet. Dungeon Explorer is a top-down action RPG with overworlds and massive convoluted dungeons to explore. There's also lots of constantly spawning enemies that will fill up the screen if you don't destroy those spawn points. Although if you're really careful, you can farm them for more items. A lot of the RPG stuff you would expect from this era are here. A few items to help out in combat, lots of villagers to talk to, and a handful of character types to choose from at the beginning. They all do have different attributes, but I tend to pick the Warlock, because look at him. He's a freaking Warlock. The fighter probably makes the most sense on paper, but yeah, I like the Warlock. Hudson Soft turned in yet another outstanding soundtrack here with some of the most memorable tunes on the system. This is an OST that you can genuinely just listen to for fun outside of the game. In fact, I recommend doing that. Overall, this isn't really my type of game per se. I tend to get lost easily and just kind of lose interest. But there's no doubt this is an extremely well-made Gauntlet-style dungeon crawler that fans of such games should absolutely check out. You can also have up to 5 people playing the game at once, which was incredibly rare for the system. I think there's only 1 or 2 other games that do that. So all you need is a turbo tap, and multiple turbo pads, and friends. Gonna hit you with a couple more shooters here, and first we're gonna talk about Magical Chase. This is another highly underrated shooter on the Turbo, and I'm not entirely sure why. It's clearly one of the better ones, but I almost never see anybody bring it up, so I guess it's up to me. You gotta set this community straight every now and then. Magical Chase was developed by Quest, and as far as I know, it's the only game they made for the system, which makes it all the more impressive because it's a really well-made game. Magical Chase is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up style shooter that gets notably more difficult than other similar games like Arzonk or Ordyne. Overall, great graphics here, with nice-looking backgrounds, and a fun main character, a little witch named Ripple that's trying to take down 6 demons she accidentally freed from a magical book or something. It doesn't really matter. You play a witch and you're shooting stuff, and it's fun. The screen gets so busy with enemies and bullets that it almost looks like it's dipping into what I would consider to be bullet hell territory, but I still wouldn't quite call it a bullet hell game. Unlike most 16-bit shooters from the time, you don't actually pick up weapons and power-ups from enemies or randomly find them floating around. Here, enemies just drop gems that you save up and spend at a shop that shows up every now and then. Kinda like Fantasy Zone, you buy weapons, upgrades, and health here that all stay with you even after you die, which is rare for the genre and a nice counterweight to the moderate difficulty. Setting itself apart even more is the pretty generous amount of hearts that you start out with that can be increased even further if you buy more. The shooting itself is fun and frenetic. You almost never have any real downtime outside of the shops, but it never really feels unmanageable either. It skirts that line really well. If you're upgrading your weapons somewhat regularly, it shouldn't be too much trouble. But if you lose focus for even a moment, you'll definitely pay for it. The music fits the game like a glove too, even though it's just a tad on the generic side. Now the controls are a bit odd. Positioning your stars and locking in their firing directions are both done with the same button, but whether or not you're firing at that time determines which one happens. And double tapping button 2 is what uses Ripple's spells, which is definitely a little bit weird to get used to. They could have just used the run button for that, like Legendary X2 or something, but whatever, it's a small gripe at most. Great game here overall, and I highly recommend it, especially to people that already enjoy shooters like Arzonk or Fantasy Zone. Magical Chase easily stands among those. Blazing Lasers is one of the earliest releases for the Turbo, and it remained one of the better top-down vertical shooters it ever got. It's pretty similar to the Soldier games, in that the levels, enemies, and bosses are all pretty standard for the genre. It's a lot more about execution than it is innovation, and there's nothing wrong with that. I wouldn't quite call it derivative though, it's just a good standard bearer for its time. The music is pretty good, with some impressive drums and dramatic melodies, though some of the tunes blur together a little bit for me. The weapons you get are all interesting, fun to use, and give the game more flavor than probably any other element. I'm not crazy about the power-up system though. Every power-up is either a Roman numeral, which is kind of annoying and makes them hard to memorize, or they're letters, which sometimes make sense and sometimes not so much. For instance, you'd think that the M would be for missiles, right? Nope! That's multi-body, which brings in an extra pod. Okay then. There's also pink balls that upgrade your weapon's firepower after collecting certain amounts of them, which you can also do by getting more Roman numerals of the same value in a row, so it is just a little bit weird and redundant. Anyway, bizarre power-up system aside, I really enjoy blazing lasers. It's not stupidly hard like, say, aerial blasters, and it also avoids being too generic like Superstar Soldier kind of is. It's a great mix of challenge and variety with levels and bosses that aren't super detailed but do still feel pretty distinct. The difficulty ramps up pretty evenly throughout too, which is something I can't say about most shooters from the time. Definitely give this game a try if you haven't yet. It's a TurboGrafx mainstay for a reason. Now, I don't normally dig strategy games, but there are a few I enjoy, and Military Madness is one of them. Probably because it's a very simple and straightforward version of strategy game that doesn't bog you down in too much nuance or superfluous systems to keep track of. It basically plays like a board game. You play as one of two empires fighting over resources on the moon, which is probably the most realistic premise of any TurboGrafx game. And you just take turns maneuvering your forces around the map, trying to hold spots with strategic value, and ultimately wipe out the other team, after which point you gain control of the area, free your prisoners, and prepare for next battle. The type of unit you move around, what it's fighting against, and the current elevation of both units are all factors that impact the outcome of every skirmish, so that's where the majority of the strategy comes in. There also seems to be just a little bit of chance thrown in. Sometimes you do more or less damage to an enemy unit than you might expect. Maps get bigger and more complex as the game goes along, but it stays pretty straightforward. It just piles on more of the same sorts of variables to force you into thinking further ahead and being super efficient with your movements. So while it does get tough, it never really gets what I would call overwhelming. Hudson Soft also graced the PS1 with a pretty thorough but faithful remake of this a few years later, so that's an option if it's more convenient for you. No matter how you play it though, it's a great time and I highly recommend it. This is also a rare instance of a Turbo game having a great two-player experience as well. Well, since we're talking about Hudson Soft, might as well talk about Bomberman 93 and how it's the perfect sequel to the original Bomberman in basically every way. It takes the simple but challenging top-down gameplay of that game and just expands on it with more enemy types, better level variety, better music, and a few tweaks around the edges, like no longer having to lose all your power-ups every time you die. That is easily my biggest gripe with the original Bomberman, so I'm glad to see it taken care of here. Bomberman 3 has the white Bomberman traveling all around the solar system to retrieve computer chips that were stolen by the evil black Bomberman. Seems a little racist, but alright. Each world has 10 levels which get bigger and more difficult with the enemy types and other stuff like teleporters and these things that push bombs around, and of course there's a boss at the end. Most of these bosses are pretty tough, so make sure to hoard as many lives as possible. Also, running out of time will result in this nonsense, so you can't dilly-dally around. As always with Bomberman games though, one of the biggest enemies you'll face is yourself. Trapping yourself with bombs by accident or just failing to get the hell out of the way of them will take more of your lives than anything else if you aren't constantly careful. The more powerful you get, the more of a danger to yourself you are, which is kind of a genius way Bomberman games balance themselves out. Bomberman 94, or as we would know it in the West, Mega Bomberman on the Genesis, would come out shortly after this, and I think it is a better game overall, but I still think 93 is worth owning and playing. It's a great time. Bomberman is a series that's been around for a long time, and it's had a lot of great entries, but I still think this is one of the better ones. And this is another one of those rare Turbo games that has an actual multiplayer, so pretty great package here overall. Definitely recommend it. Alien Crush is what you would get if H.R. Geiger exploded all over a pinball machine, and if that's not enough to get you to play it, then I should also probably mention that it's one of the best games in the TurboGrafx's library. Regardless of whether or not you care about pinball, this is a game that you need to try. All the disturbing imagery and interesting ways the board changes as you play make it a great video pinball experience. But it goes the extra mile with a small handful of bonus stages too that warp you to a different board and offer a lot of challenge. The main board itself is 2 levels that you'll be going back and forth between a lot as the ball gets launched, bounced, and spit out all over the place. It's not a whole lot of space, and you will see most of what the game does within about 20 to 30 minutes. But it still manages to stay fun for much longer than that if you can get into the loop of chasing better scores and mastering the bonus stages. The graphics are outstanding for the time. Lots of detailed mouths, bones, viscera, and things that defy description everywhere you look. Out of all the 16-bit games that borrowed aesthetics from the Alien movies, this one perhaps does it the best. And it kind of twists it into its own weird direction that I really enjoy. It's just kind of hard to take your eyes off it. The creature with all the eyes on the bottom here is probably my favorite part, but every inch of the game is packed with disturbing little details. The music, of course, is also really great and gives you 2 songs to pick from, both of which are equally good and fit the vibe just right. Alien Crush isn't perfect though. The quick cut to black as you go between the 2 screens is a little bit disorienting. There's also some moments where it really just feels like your ball goes straight down the middle and can't be saved. Now there is a tilt functionality in the game that supposedly can help avoid these moments, but I haven't been able to make that work. Ultimately though, while it's pretty clear this is an early effort on a strange new idea for Naxat Soft, it's just too much fun and dripping with far too much atmosphere for me not to consider it one of the best games on the system. Devil's Crush is the perfect follow-up to Alien Crush, and I think it tops it in basically every conceivable way. The alien theme is switched out for a satanic, occult one, and it works perfect. It's pretty clear that they knew what could be improved from the last game and just went for it, with 3 floors instead of 2 and smooth scrolling between them instead of a sudden cut. Also, a larger number of bonus levels that all stand apart from each other really well. Some of these might actually be my favorite part of the game, which is saying a lot because I really love the main board. Like Alien Crush, every inch of Devil's Crush is densely packed with detail. Nothing feels like it was put there without a lot of thought, and there's just a ton of objects for your ball to smash into and little pockets for it to end up in. Even now, after playing it for 30 years, I still feel like I'm discovering new things every once in a while. Of course, the most fun thing to do is get this woman's face to transform further and further into a demon dragon thing. Racking up tons of points along the way, of course. This is basically a perfect game, with essentially no flaws to speak of. The 2-player mode is perfect with a friend, the visuals and general variety of the different areas keep it far more engaging than any pinball game has any right to be, and the soundtrack is perhaps the best in the entire library, which is saying a lot, I know. I adore a lot of the music throughout the Turbo's catalog, but honestly, if I had to pick a favorite collection of tunes, it would probably have to be this one. It's just so fantastically well written and perfectly mixed music that gives just the right amount of dread, drama, and epicness in each and every song. If some metal band with the right chops would like to get the rights to this stuff and produce a cover album, I'd be first in line to buy it. If somebody could get Children of Bodom on that, that'd be great. Please and thanks. So, there you have it. Between this video and part 1, I think you have a pretty definitive summary of the best games on the TurboGrafx. Now, there are still plenty of other great ones though, so I highly recommend checking out my other videos I have about this library if you want to delve deeper into the rabbit hole. It's a great library overall with far more hits than misses, and a lot of games that you can't play on other platforms. But in the meantime, thanks for watching.